Imagine a world so perfectly connected that the breaking of a single thread could bring it all down. 3,000 years ago, before Rome had a name, before the temples of Athens were dreamt into stone, long before the Bible's first verse was ever spoken, the world was already global. This wasn't a primitive past, it was a high civilization. Palaces buzzed with scribes who spoke a common language. Kings from different continents called each other brother. Letters crossed oceans, sealed in clay and marked with trust. From the dusty peaks of Mycenaean Greece to the fertile banks of the Nile, from the mountain fortresses of the Hittites to the merchant harbours of Ugarit, civilizations weren't isolated. They were entangled, interlinked by trade, diplomacy and mutual dependence. Tin from Afghanistan met copper from Cyprus to create the bronze that fueled their tools, their weapons, their rise. Ships crossed the Aegean bearing gold, glass, ivory, spices, cedar and grain. Messengers carried treaties, demands and blessings in Akkadian, the diplomatic tongue of the day. This was a golden web, a network so vast and so finely woven that it spanned continents. And it worked, it thrived. For centuries, the system delivered abundance. Art flourished, cities swelled, technology advanced, and with each new connection, the world felt safer, smarter, richer. But prosperity can become a kind of blindness. Complexity isn't always strength. And the more a system depends on itself to survive, the less it knows how to stand alone. That was their flaw. Because the very thing that made their world strong, their deep, elegant interdependence, also made it fragile. Every success story carries within it the seed of its own unraveling. And no one, not even the kings who sat on ivory thrones, saw what was coming, not until the web began to snap. And when it did, it didn't fray slowly, it ripped. And the sound of that tear is still echoing through time. The end didn't look like chaos, it looked like silence. In the year 1177 BCE, the world began to forget how to function. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years fell in weeks, not in a grand war, not with one enemy, but with many small wounds that together bled out the age. For a long time, historians blamed a mysterious enemy, the sea peoples, raiders from the unknown, marauders from the waves. But it was never just one invasion. It was never just one catastrophe. The truth was far more terrifying. It was everything. First came the drought. It didn't last a year. It lasted generations. Pollen samples and sediment cores confirm it. A mega drought swept through the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed. Harvests withered. Famine took hold. A famine not of weeks or seasons, but of decades. Hunger doesn't just weaken people, it weakens systems. It makes empires brittle. Then the earth itself turned against them. Archaeological evidence shows an earthquake storm rippling through the region. Not one quake, but a swarm. Cities shaken to rubble. Walls that had stood for centuries collapsed overnight. The foundations of temples cracked. And with each tremor, trust in the old gods broke a little more. As hunger deepened and quakes shattered confidence, people moved. Whole populations, desperate, displaced, dying, began to migrate. And with migration came violence. Refugees arrived not with offerings, but with weapons. Families became raiding parties. The sea peoples weren't just warriors, they were survivors. They weren't just attacking, they were escaping. Then came the collapse of trade. Tin from the east, copper from the islands, vanished. The economic bloodstream froze. Bronze tools snapped, and there were no replacements. Palaces waited for ships that would never come. Workshops closed. Markets emptied. The entire system, once global, now felt local and alone. And finally, the politics broke. Letters between kings, once filled with ceremony, stopped arriving. There are no diplomatic records after 1177 BCE, no peace treaties, no marriage alliances, just silence. But in the middle of it all, a voice survives. From Ugarit, a coastal city in modern Syria, a final message was etched into clay. The enemy's ships are here, my cities are burned, there is no help. That tablet was found centuries later, still in the kiln, never delivered. This isn't the story of a single fall. It's the story of a world collapsing in real time, kingdom by kingdom, trade route by trade route, dream by dream. Not with fire from the sky, but with the slow and unstoppable unweaving of everything they thought permanent. And still, the most terrifying part isn't that they collapsed. It's that they didn't see it happening, because no one ever does. The last moment always feels like the middle, until it isn't. The world didn't end in 1177 BCE, it simply forgot itself. In the stillness after the fall, the cities stood like hollow skeletons. The fires had burned out, but the smoke lingered in the stones. The courtyards were empty, the scribes were gone. The palaces that once pulsed with administration and trade now echoed only with the wind. And that's where forgetting begins, not in the fire, but in the silence that follows. In Mycenae, among the ruins of a palace, archaeologists found clay tablets, inscribed hastily, urgently, as if someone was trying to hold civilization together by sheer will. One tablet speaks of sending bronze to men guarding the coast. Perhaps they knew an invasion was coming, perhaps they only suspected. But when the fire reached them, no one came back to read what they wrote. Their words were frozen mid-sentence, and then silence. Not just in Mycenae, everywhere. The script they used, Linear B, vanished. Within a generation, the Greeks couldn't read their ancestors. They didn't write, they sang. They told stories. Myths filled the void left by memory. Achilles and Odysseus stepped into the space where history had once lived. In Ugarit, a royal library burned with the city. The language itself, Ugaritic, was buried so deeply in ash and time that the modern world didn't even know it existed until a farmer's shovel struck a stone in 1929. We hadn't just lost cities, we'd lost the ability to remember them. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, the last king left no monument, no declaration, no tomb, only ruins. His palace archives remained intact but unopened. He vanished into the mountains or into the fire, no one knows. No one even thought to ask until thousands of years later. Even Egypt, the last great survivor, began to fray. Ramses III fought back the Sea Peoples. He won. But the cost was so high that Egypt itself began to slip. Authority splintered, the treasury emptied, the confidence of the old kingdom dissolved like ink in water. A few decades later, an Egyptian priest named Wenamun set sail to Lebanon to buy cedar. He carried credentials, pride, the authority of a temple. But when he arrived, he was robbed, mocked, refused. The local kings laughed at him. Egypt, they said, you're no longer what you were. Wenamun begged, bartered, got stranded. His journey reads like the diary of a man trapped in a world he no longer recognized. A world where old empires were just stories people used to tell. This was the first dark age. But dark doesn't mean empty, it means unseen. It means the systems broke down and the stories shifted underground. People still lived, they adapted, they moved. They learned to forge iron, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It wasn't better, it was different, it was survival. From the fringes came new voices. The Philistines, likely born of the chaos, built settlements along the coast. The Israelites took to the highlands. The Arameans, the Phoenicians, small peoples with small beginnings, grew. The age of grand alliances and mighty kings had ended. But something else was stirring, not a return, a reset. What if the past you're hearing isn't just a story? What if it's a reflection? The world that collapsed in 1177 BCE wasn't backwards or primitive. It was interconnected, complex, and advanced for its time. Their palaces were economic hubs, their cities nodes in a global supply chain. Their rulers believed in continuity, in legacy, in the illusion of permanence. And yet, within a few decades, it all came undone. Today, we live in a civilization that runs on similar assumptions. We depend on invisible networks of trade, electricity, communication, energy. We trust that food will arrive on shelves, that water will run, that the servers will stay on, that the world will function because it always has. But the Bronze Age collapse whispers a warning. Complexity is not resilience. The more tightly we're connected, the more vulnerable we become to cascading failure. One disruption leads to another, one thread breaks and the web tears. In 1177 BCE, it was drought, famine, earthquakes, migration, trade collapse, internal revolt. Each of these pressures alone might have been survivable. Together, they were unstoppable. And they didn't arrive as explosions. They crept in slowly, quietly, until it was too late to stop them. Sound familiar? We face rising temperatures, vanishing water, fragile supply chains, political unrest, global displacement. We face technologies that connect us, but also isolate us, that empower, but also expose. And still we move forward, assuming the system will hold, that someone somewhere will fix it in time. But the kings of the late Bronze Age thought the same. They didn't see the collapse coming. Neither did their scribes, nor their merchants, nor their soldiers. Not until the letters stopped arriving. Not until the ships stopped returning. Not until the cities burned and the fields dried up and the people stopped believing that tomorrow would look like yesterday. The only difference between us and them is that we know their story, and that knowledge is a gift they didn't have. What we do with it is entirely up to us. Because collapse isn't always sudden. Sometimes it's just a slow forgetting of what matters, of what holds things together, of how fragile the whole system really is. And if we don't pay attention to the edges fraying now, we might wake up one day and find the center already gone. Unless we choose to remember, unless we choose to act, unless we choose not to follow them into the silence. We often imagine the fall of civilization as a cataclysm, loud, final, unmistakable. But the more frightening truth is this: collapse whispers, it erodes, it seeps in through cracks, and by the time we notice it, it's already inside. After 1177 BCE, the people who remained didn't talk about collapse. They didn't have the words. What they had was hunger, displacement, loss, and something more devastating than all of it: they forgot. Not because they chose to, because they had to. Because when systems vanish, memory follows. Not immediately, not with ceremony, just with time. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaeans, vanished. Not a single Greek in the generations that followed could read the names carved by their ancestors. The words of kings, the records of harvests, the plans for palaces, all turned to silence. For 4 centuries, the Greeks lived without writing, without archives, without identity, beyond the stories passed from mouth to mouth. What once was fact became myth. History blurred into poetry. In Ugarit, the songs, the prayers, the economic contracts, the literary epics, all written in a language the world forgot. We didn't even know Ugaritic existed until we dug it out of the ground in the 20th century. It wasn't just a city that disappeared. It was an entire vocabulary of thought, erased so cleanly that even its name was lost. The Hittites, once rulers of an empire that rivaled Egypt, fell so completely that their capital, Hattusa, lay undisturbed for millennia. Their names vanished from collective memory, their language, their laws, their ambitions reduced to dust and mystery. It was as if they'd never been there at all, and yet the people survived. They tilled the same earth. They prayed to new gods or old ones under different names. They told stories around fires, stories that slowly mutated into legends. Somewhere in those ashes was a boy who would one day be called Homer, and from the ruins he would sing the memory of a world already fading. That's the hidden tragedy of collapse. It doesn't just take structures, it takes meaning. A civilization doesn't truly fall when its walls crumble. It falls when no one remembers why they were built. That's the danger we never speak of. Not the loss of power, but the loss of self. We believe our world is recorded, backed up, preserved. That everything we are is saved in the cloud. But what happens when the cloud disappears? When the power dies? When no one remembers the passwords? Would we remember how to rebuild? Would we remember what mattered? Or would we, like those before us, tell stories of a world once great while planting seeds in soil we no longer understand. The people of 1177 didn't know they were forgetting. They were just trying to survive. And in doing so, they passed through a dark corridor in history, where the light didn't vanish, but flickered, waiting for someone someday to carry it forward. Every collapse is a kind of rebirth, not one we ask for, not one we plan, but one we survive. After the palaces burned, after the kings fell silent, after the great ships stopped coming, something ancient remained, something older than cities or scripts or trade routes. People. They gathered, they adapted, they forged iron when bronze became scarce. They built with less, not because they preferred it, but because they had no other choice. And in that necessity, they found something stronger than stone: resilience. The Israelites emerged in the hill country, not with monuments, but with memory. The Phoenicians took to the seas, not as an empire, but as merchants, who would one day give the world the alphabet. The Philistines, born from the very chaos that shattered the old order, made homes in the lands where the fires had barely cooled. What rose from the ashes wasn't familiar, it wasn't grand, it wasn't golden, but it was alive and it learned. Slowly writing returned, first on broken potsherds, then in carvings, then in scrolls, new scripts, new voices, new stories. They didn't resurrect the past, they wrote something new, shaped by memory and loss and the hard-earned wisdom of starting again. This is the final truth of 1177 BCE. That collapse is not the end of the story. It's the blank page that follows. A chance not to rebuild what was, but to decide what should be. We are not them, but we are not separate from them. We are still part of the same experiment, trying to weave a stable world out of fragile threads. And like them, we live with droughts, migrations, systemic fragilities, and the illusion of permanence. But unlike them, we have their story. We know what they didn't, that complex systems break and memory is the first casualty, that what feels eternal never is, that the world can collapse slowly while everyone's still watching their daily routines, and that survival isn't about strength, it's about adaptation, it's about remembering, it's about carrying forward the embers when the fire dies. So, if this story moved you, share it. Not for views, not for clicks, but because remembering is resistance. Let this be the tablet that doesn't burn in the kiln. Let it reach someone, maybe years from now, who needs to know that we were paying attention, that we listened, that we learned, and that when the storm came, we chose not to vanish into myth. We chose to endure. And from that choice, something better began.